Well, everybody, welcome. My name is John Steniford. I'm a senior fellow at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education, and I was the director this past year. I would like to thank you all for being here, and I'd like to especially thank the African American Studies program and the Graham Center for Public Service for co-sponsoring this event. The Hamilton Center is a new academic unit at UF designed to provide the knowledge, habits of thought, analytical skills, and character to be citizens and leaders in a free society. One of the things one has to sort of learn or develop to do this is learn the ability to discuss important questions, debate and disagree, while remaining united in the search for truth. To do that, debates and discussions have to be conducted in a spirit of humility, charity, and genuine desire to understand where the other side is coming from. Our discussions today model these virtues without parallel. And let me briefly introduce each of them. First, Dr. Cornel West is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Chair at Union Theological Seminary. He's the former professor of practice of public philosophy at Harvard University and professor emeritus at Princeton University. Dr. West teaches on the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as well as courses in the philosophy of religion, African American critical thought, and a wide range of subjects, including the classics, philosophy, politics, cultural theory, literature, and music. In all his public communications, he strives to keep alive the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy of telling the truth and bearing witness to love and justice. He has written 20 books and has edited an additional 13. He's best known for his classics, Race Matters and Democracy Matters, and for his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. His most recent book, Black Prophetic Fire, offers an unflinching look at 19th and 20th century African American leaders and their visionary legacies. Our second speaker is Professor Robert George. Dr. George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's also been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. He's a specialist in moral and political philosophy, constitutional law, bioethics, and the theory of conscience. He has served as chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and before that on the President's Council on Bioethics, and as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He has also served as the U.S. member of UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. He is a former judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. Professor George is the author of many works, including Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, In Defense of Natural Law, The Clash of Orthodoxies, and Conscience and Its Enemies. Finally, the discussion today will be moderated by the excellent new director of the Hamilton Center, Dr. Will Imboden. William Imboden is a professor and director of the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. He previously served as the William Powers Jr. Chair and Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security, Associate Professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and Distinguished Scholar at the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law, all at the University of Texas at Austin. He also serves as Editor-in-Chief of the Texas National Security Review. Imboden's other current roles include Associate with the National Intelligence Council, member of the CIA Historical Advisory Panel, member of the State Department's Historical Advisory Council, and Senior Fellow with the Trinity Forum. Previously, he served as Senior Director for Strategic Planning on the National Security Council, as a member of the State Department Policy Planning staff, as a special advisor in the Office of International Religious Freedom, and as a staff member in both the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. He also served as head of the London-based Legatum Institute and as a Civitas Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Imboden is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also the author of a number of works, including The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink, and Religion and American Foreign Policy, 1945 to 1960, The Soul of Containment. So without further ado, our speakers.
Go right ahead, Becky.
Well, thank you very much, John. And I got to say, as a very new arrival here in Gainesville, my family and I just moved here last month. I just started this new job. And this is our first Hamilton Center event of the academic year. And I was talking to my staff this morning. I said, all right, I know we've got a couple of great speakers come in, but do you think anyone's going to show up? And so it is nice to see that one or two people have shown up. Anyway, welcome to all of you. Thank you for your forbearance and goodwill, especially in a crowded room like this. So my job as moderator is primarily to stay out of the way, to wind these two up and let them go. So we're going to do a semi-structured discussion for about an hour or so, and then we will have some time for audience Q&A at the end. And we'll come back to that in a second. So anyway, Robbie, Cornel, it is great to have both of you here. Let's begin at the beginning. Each of you tell us just a little bit about your respective backgrounds. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What were kind of the formative experiences in your life in becoming who you are now?
Brother Robbie, you want to jump right in on me?
You go ahead, Cornel.
You sure?
I'm sure.
All right. Let me first say I'm blessed to be here. Florida is always a complicated place. Always a complicated place. But people are complicated everywhere, every corner of the globe. Humanity is humanity. And we struggle with the best of what we have. So I'm blessed to be my mama's child and my daddy's kid. Both of them are gone. I'm here with my beloved, magnificent daughter, Zaytun. Just raise your hand up. She knows who her grandmama was. I'll never be one half the human being she was. Irene B. West. Elementary school named after her, first grade teacher, principal. Taught vacation Bible school at my church, Shiloh Baptist Church, where I was shaped and molded by Reverend Willie P. Cook and Deacon Hinton and Sarah Ray, my vacation Bible school teacher. And my father, Clifton. So for me, I come out, Irene, Cliff, West, Shiloh Baptist Church, Black Panther Party is right next door. They wouldn't allow me because I'm a Jesus-loving free black man, but I love their focus on poor people. I love their focus on the wretched of the earth. So we had ideological differences, but we overlapped in a significant way. And Brother Robbie knows from his own love of my mother, just like I love his mother and his father so much, and God bless him. You know the high standards, what the Greeks would call arete, the highest moral and spiritual standards of what it means to be human, coming from the chocolate-sided town of a people who've been hated but still dish out love, who've been terrorized, still dish out freedom, who've been traumatized and still dish out wounded healers. I fall short on all of those accounts, but I know what my standards are. And so in that sense, I got a jump start in life. I come from the west side of town. You come from the chocolate side of town. You come from Shiloh Baptist Church. You got an armor that's so thick that no level of catastrophe can crush the love, can crush the spirit to fight for freedom, and crush wanting to be a wounded healer rather than a wounded hurter. And it's always a blessing to be with my dear brother Robbie. I love this brother deeply. He's not just a friend, he's my brother, even when he's wrong. Even when he's right. We wrestle, we struggle, but we revel in each other's humanity because we know that love is in no way reducible to politics. And we know that deep, deep brotherhood and sisterhood and siblinghood is not reducible to agreement on public policy. But we're honest about our differences. But we proceed in such a way. We try to open ourselves to be, in the language of John Coltrane, forces for good.
Well, thank you, Brother Cornel. First, I want to say what an honor it is to be part of the Hamilton program at the University of Florida. It's a very exciting program. These days, more and more, I'm hearing people in public life, pretty much across the board, what would the proper word be? Derogating classical education. Saying, well, why waste your time studying history, philosophy, classics, old books? You should be studying practical things that will get you ahead. I have no objection to getting ahead, but I think our culture and our society really depends heavily on having lots of people who are willing to imbibe the wisdom of the great thinkers who have gone before, the philosophers, the theologians, the literary people, the people from all the different fields and disciplines across the arts and sciences and learned professions. And so I cheer when I hear about an initiative like the Hamilton program that is dedicated not only to civic education at the highest level, as important as that is, but to classical learning as well. And of course here, Brother West has been absolutely exemplary as a defender and as a practitioner of classical education. I know what I'm talking about here because he and I have been in the classroom together many times, teaching Sophocles, Plato, St. Augustine, all the way up to the 19th and 20th centuries. Mill, Marx, Newman, Dewey, Buber, C.S. Lewis, Leo Strauss, Martin Luther King. And learning from those thinkers and helping our students to learn from those thinkers and to appreciate what they do. So I salute you, Will, and I salute everyone who is involved with and is responsible for the Hamilton program. I wish you the very best. I did know and love Irene West. And Cornel and I are members of each other's families. He's from the West Wing of the George family, as I sometimes put it. His beloved daughter, Zaytun, is my honorary niece, and I love her like she's my own daughter. And this has been one of the great blessings of my life for our families to be united in the way that they are. While Cornel was born in Oklahoma and grew up out in Sacramento, I was born and brought up in the hills of West Virginia, in the heart of Appalachia. Both of my grandfathers were coal miners. They didn't have the opportunity to go to college or even to go to high school. One of my grandmothers was able to go to high school, but not to college. I often explain why I didn't end up in the coal mines by reference to World War II. Now, I was born 10 years after World War II was over. But my father was drafted right out of high school, 18 years old, hadn't even finished high school. They sent his parents a diploma. Sent him off first to training camp and then to Normandy to fight. And as a result of that experience and learning some skills in the military, he didn't have to go into the coal mines when he came back. Didn't have an opportunity for a college education, wasn't able to take advantage of the GI Bill, but nevertheless didn't have to work in the coal mines, as a result of which I guess I don't have to work in the coal mines. But I was the first in my family to go to college. And when I was growing up, coming from a humble background, my parents and my grandparents, my relatives, looked at education very much in instrumental terms. They might well have cheered this emphasis we're hearing today on practical education. They saw it as a way for my generation, for me and my brothers. I was the oldest, so I was the first to go to college in my family. They saw it as a way to rise in the world. A profession, more money, status, influence, those kinds of things, being somebody. I had never considered the possibility that that wasn't the whole story when it came to education and learning. I hadn't even considered it. I just imbibed the idea that the point of college was to get ahead professionally and economically and socially. And it wasn't until my sophomore year when I was assigned Plato's dialogue Gorgias in an introduction to political theory class. Just a big survey class from Plato to John Rawls. Now, how many of you have read Plato's Gorgias? Yeah, this is great. Wonderful to see so many hands go up.
You all get A's.
Well, you know that dialogue, that Platonic dialogue, is about why we have dialogue. It's about why we discuss, why we wrestle, why we debate, why we try to get at the truth of things. Is it to get ahead? Is it to be somebody? Is it to make a good impression? Is it to achieve high office? Not that there's anything bad about achieving high office.
Depends on what you do with your power that you have. But no, you go right ahead, go right ahead, go right ahead. We won't get into that right now.
But Plato gives us the story of Socrates making a nuisance of himself, badgering the people on the streets of Athens, Athenian democracy. The story of Socrates raising these questions and trying to get at the answer to the question, why are we doing this? And of course, for those who've read the dialogue, what he shows us, what he brings us around to seeing is that the real value, the fundamental value of truth-seeking, debate, discussion, discourse, knowledge, is not something instrumental, not something to which it is a mere means, but rather knowledge for its own sake, truth for its own sake, wisdom and understanding for their own sake, as inherent enrichments of ourselves as human persons, as rational creatures. Knowledge as intrinsically valuable. Well, as I say, I'd never even considered that possibility, but suddenly I could see it. Plato does that to you. He shows you things that you might not even have considered before, but there it was. And then for me, nothing was the same. At that point, I realized I had to rethink everything about my life and about myself, about my political views, about my moral views, about my religious views. Like Cornel, I was raised in the church, but I had adopted almost all of my beliefs essentially for tribal reasons or familial reasons. Or it's because, I was aspiring to be a sophisticated person because I thought, well, this is what sophisticated people believe. This is what progressive, smart, enlightened people think. And I had to rethink all of that. And let me tell you something. That was unnerving. It was exhilarating, but it was unnerving. Because once you get on that train, you don't know who you're going to be, much less where you're going to be when you get off that train. Scary. But wow, is it ever worth doing? And I hope that the Hamilton Center here at Florida will be joining with the other units of the university that promote that kind of deep thinking, what Cornel, following the Greeks, calls paideia, not cheap schooling, deep learning. Not just getting information and acquiring certain analytical skills, but seeking understanding, seeking wisdom, philosophia. I hope that the Hamilton Center, in union with all the other units of the university that are offering you young people that kind of education, I hope you succeed above all expectations. But thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. May it be thus. I think I'll just end on that note, right? So, okay. Tell us a little more about your friendship. When did the two of you first meet? Did you realize right away that you were going to become close friends like this? How has your friendship evolved over time?
You want to tell that story?
Yeah, I'll tell a little bit of it.
I can.
So I arrived at Princeton back in the Middle Ages, 1985. Fall of 1985. Now, Cornel West was already an established and important figure, but not at Princeton. He'd begun at Union Theological Seminary, where he has now returned, and then it was Yale, and then to Princeton. So Cornel became my colleague at Princeton in the early 90s, I think, and we were in some faculty seminars together. And, of course, I was deeply impressed by Professor West. He was already, as I say, an important figure and well beyond Princeton. But the thing that I found most impressive was that in these faculty seminars where we were talking about the big issues, the issues of meaning and value, justice and human rights, the human good, human nature, human dignity, big questions, Cornel was the guy, Professor West was the guy who kept us on topic, that is, on those questions. Being academics and being specialists, and with academic life becoming more and more and more specialized, too often the conversation would go into the technical things, conceptual analysis, logical analysis, all of which is good, but you got to bring it back to the real point of the exercise, and that is trying to understand the big questions, the questions of God and man, the questions of justice and rights, the questions of good and bad, right and wrong, morality and immorality. And it was Professor West always bringing us back to those questions. Now, I didn't think he always got the right answers, but he was asking the right questions. And that's 95% of the battle. You're never going to get to the right answers unless you ask the right questions. So we knew each other cordially. We were friendly acquaintances. But then one day in 2005, a student who was a student in both of our courses, a guy named Andrew Perlman.
Brother Andrew.
Andrew knocked at my door and said, Professor George, I'd like to talk with you. Some of my fellow students and I are founding a new magazine at Princeton. It's going to be called The Green Light. It's going to be a magazine of arts and culture and literature and politics. It's going to be our own campus version of the New Yorker. And for every issue of the magazine, starting with the inaugural issue, which we hope to have out in a couple of months, we want to feature an interview of one professor at Princeton by another professor. I said, well, that sounds very interesting. And he said, well, we have asked Professor Cornel West to be the first interviewer, and we asked him who he would like to interview. And he said he would like to interview you. Well, I was flattered to death. So I said, well, of course, I'll be delighted to be interviewed by Professor West. So the appointed day came. Here came Andrew. He had an old-fashioned, I don't know if this will mean anything to the students these days, cassette tape recorder. Yeah, cassette tape recorder. You guys all use these things, right? So has a cassette tape recorder, had a photographer there with him, flashing pictures with a flash. You know what a flash is? So he turns on the tape recorder and says, go. Well, Cornel and I start a rollicking conversation. It was supposed to be an interview. It was a rollicking conversation about everything. The big existential questions, the more precise policy questions. We were into everything. That halfway through what was supposed to be our conversation, the cassette flips off, and Andrew jumps up and waves his arm, stop, flips over that tape, puts it on again. We keep going. Finally, the tape runs out. We keep going, and we keep going, and we keep going. We had started at 2 o'clock. I look at my watch. It's 6 o'clock. I said, Brother Cornel, we've been at this for 4. This has been wonderful, and I hate to quit, but I'm going to have to go home for dinner. You and I really were interested in all the same things, and, I love learning from you in this conversation. We really need to get together and get to know each other better. He said, oh, Brother Rob, we absolutely have to do that. So then we walked down to my car. I said, walk me down to my car. I walked down to my car, parked on William Street, right next to the Princeton University Press, and I stood there with my hand on the latch for another 45 minutes while we went back and forth. I finally said, Cornel, my wife is going to put out a missing persons report on me. Well, just a few days later, providentially, some of the senior faculty members, Cornel and myself, got a note from the dean of the college saying, we at Princeton really pride ourselves on having our senior faculty teach all of our students, all of our undergraduates, even the freshmen have access to the senior faculty, and because they can take freshman seminars taught by senior faculty. But the trouble is, we don't have senior faculty actually signing up to teach the seminars. So I really need to encourage you senior members of the faculty to teach these seminars. So the light bulb went off over my head, and I said, gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if Brother Cornel and I would just carry on a conversation like the one we had a few days ago with 16 brilliant Princeton freshmen, and we could do a different book or reading each week and just keep that conversation going. So I proposed it to Cornel, and he said, Brother Robbie, that would be a wonderful thing. Let's do it. And we did it. We had several hundred students sign up for the 16 places, so we had to disappoint a lot of people, but it was a wonderful experience. You've heard about two people having chemistry. This was beyond chemistry. From the very first moments of that first seminar, it was magic, and I loved it. And I've just never learned so much myself from being in a seminar because this man's a master teacher. So the success of that seminar just led us to keep doing it until he abandoned me for Harvard. But then he came back on his first leave, and we did it again. And since then, we've been taking our show on the road and trying to get people to understand why we do what we do and why we think it's so important. Cornel?
No, indeed. mean, it just strikes me, we live in such a moment of spiritual decay and moral decadence that you could get two brothers, ebony and ivory, vanilla and chocolate, who have deep ideological and political differences, but still revel in each other's humanity and be called an odd couple. I mean, what an indictment of a culture that you can't have love and friendship across politics, race, region, and so forth. One of the things that I've been just so blessed with my magnificent daughter Zayton, I tell her all the time, is integrity, honesty, decency is promiscuous, because you can be right-wing and a gangster, centrist and a gangster, leftist and a gangster in terms of how you treat people. Or you can be deeply conservative and have integrity and honesty, which means what? No posing, no posturing. Say what you mean what you say. Own your conclusions, and then you clash. Honestly. And we reached the point now in the culture where it's not just polarization, but it's gangsterization. And gangsterization is always worse than hypocrisy, isn't it? La Rochelle Foucault reminds us hypocrisy is a tribute that vice pays to virtue. If you're a hypocrite, at least you know what the standards are. You're just trying to get away with it. But if you're a gangster, no standards, no accountability, no responsibility, no answerability, anything, say anything, do anything, don't have to worry about any accountability. That's the 11th commandment. Thou shalt not get caught. That's too much of the culture that we live in. And so when you talk about classical education, you're not talking about a particular group of people in the world who have a certain superiority over others that might be shot through at tradition. But there's always the Socratic ones. There's always the prophetic ones. Socrates critical of Athenian democracy. Plato picks up the mantle and goes. Jesus weeps. Socrates never sheds a tear. Already a problem. Learn much from Socrates, but maybe not a lot about what it means to love a person. You can love philosophy, but not a person. Anybody who's loved a person that shed tears? Self-mastery is not the proper attitude at your mama's funeral. When you gonna cry, Socrates? Are you married? Yes. Well, you probably cried and just didn't tell us about it. You got kids? Yes. Then you probably had kid problems. You didn't tell us about it. But that's wrestling with, most importantly, and this is what Brother Robbie and I wrestle with all the time, what it means to be human so that issues of character and integrity and decency are not reducible to ideology and politics. And you discover that over your life. I know Brother Will understands, but reading Neba, he's a fellow Baptist, so both of us Baptists stand in the need of prayer, you know what I mean? In a deep, deep sense. We carry a heavy burden in terms of tradition, but Martin Luther King was a Baptist, Aretha Franklin was a Baptist, Curtis Mayfield was a Baptist. Well, that's good company for me. Good company for Brother Will, too. And there's some vanilla ones. We won't get into that right now. Miles Horton. Oh, you all know who Miles Horton was? The founder of Highlander Center, which is where Rosa Parks was 3 months before she decided to go back to Alabama and sit down on a bus in order to stand up for justice when she heard the lecture by Brother Howard from Mississippi, November 27, 1955, in Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and a new preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. had just taken over that church, and she talked about Emmett Till. You all know who Emmett Till is? Oh, yeah, she talked about Emmett Till. 4 days later, she sits down on that bus with Emmett Till on his mind. Is that right, my dear sister? Absolutely. Meaning what? It's not about skin color only. No, not at all. It's about a choice of what it means to be human and want to connect with somebody's humanity in such a way that you courageously take a risk. So that paideia that Brother Robbie's talking about Has to do with how do you see things more clearly and feel things more deeply and hear things more readily and act more courageously in a humble manner, a self-critical manner, so you will endlessly grow or learn how to die in order to learn how to live. That's what education is really about. Learning how to die in order to learn how to live. Because when you give up a certain assumption and presupposition, that's a form of death. How many freshmen we got? Don't be shy. Raise your hand high. Raise your hand. Freshmen are special. Special women are very special, especially at the University of Florida. When you come in, you got your own assumptions and presuppositions. You're going to have to let some of them go. And when you let them go, that's a form of death, so that you learn, in fact, that what emerges from where you were, you are a new person in process. You're more braver, you're more mature, you're more sophisticated, you're more refined, but you'll never reach a level where you still ought not to grow. It is endless. It is relentless. But by talking about death, it means that much is at stake. And part of the problem, this is what Brother Robbie and I have deep agreements, even given our political disagreements. One of the reasons why I asked this brother to have our dialogue is he's got a sense of vocation, not just profession. He's got a sense of calling, not just his career. And professionalism has taken over in such a degree that it's hard to find courage among the professionals, because the culture of profession is about upward mobility. It's about conformity. It's about complacency. It's about being well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference as you make your way to be the next peacock. So everybody can look at you as the grand celebrity status. I could hear my grandmother saying peacocks strut because they can't fly. No, we talking about eagles. Fly with nobility and look low and stay in contact with the humanity of people across gender and race and national identity and sexual orientation and disability or whatever. That's at the human level, what it means to be human. And that's exactly what we were able to do in our classes with a variety of different voices.
Lift every voice.
Lift every voice, not lift every echo. It looked as if our students were moving to become an echo, just an extension of a silo. We said, Socrates matters. It looked like they claimed to be loving everybody, but got hatred around the corner. Jesus is supposed to matter, not because you're a Christian, but because he's a serious brother. We're not looking for theological claims. We're looking for arete, excellence, moral greatness. Brother David, you all are blessed to have this leader now in the Black Studies. Give it up for this brother now. Fresh from Connecticut College, you see. But when he's talking about Toni Morrison, when he's talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, when he's talking about Harriet Tubman, when he's talking about Frederick Douglass, this is not some kind of ghettoized set of figures. You're talking about the highest levels of moral and spiritual greatness in their witness, in their attempt to come to terms with forms of evil. And this is true for every group. Every country has ways of these figures, has traditions, and they're not just the famous ones. They're found in the households. They're found in the mosques and the churches and the synagogue. And I'm a hang loose Baptist, so I say they found in the nightclubs. I spend a lot of time in the nightclub. I'm a jazz man and a blues man, so I love Jesus, but I love Friday night at the club. Somebody pray for me, you know what I mean? But what's happening there is also what's happening right here. Human beings trying to come to terms with what it means to be human at the deepest level, with all of the wounds and bruises and scars that go with that. And there's always going to be tremendous struggle and clashes, class struggles, struggles against white supremacy, struggles against male supremacy. This is not just PC chit-chat. These are actual structures that have impact on precious human beings, the transphobias and the homophobias and the anti-Jewish and the anti-Arab and the anti-Palestinian and the anti-Muslim and the anti-Roma. It goes hand in hand. And yet we try in our own finite ways, our fallible ways, to try to forge ahead, because in moments of decay and decadence, in some ways, one of the major challenges is that it's nihilism. It's Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic.
I think if you learn from the great teachers of humanity, of all the traditions, East and West, you learn that there are some things in life that matter, but not all that much. And there are other things in life that really matter. The things that matter are legitimate concerns, but still don't ultimately matter, don't matter all that much, are things that, especially when we're younger and making our ways in life, can tend to become our focus. Money, power, status, influence, prestige, celebrity, getting ahead, being someone. Those aren't bad things. If you have money, you can build businesses, create jobs for people, provide goods and services that people need and want, care for your own family. You got a lot of money, you can do philanthropy, you can give to good causes. Same with influence. If you have influence, you can use it for good. If you have power, you can use it for good. If you have status, if you have prestige, if you're a celebrity, you can use it for good. But those things are merely instrumentally good. That is, they're good as means to other ends. They're not good in themselves. You can use them for good, and you should. And it's good, it's fine to aspire to have them in order to do good with them. But you can also do bad with them. You can also be indifferent with success of every type. So those are the things that matter. They can be legitimate goals, especially as you're being educated and thinking about your futures and your careers. But they're not the things that really matter. That is the things that are worthwhile, not as means to other ends, or merely as means to other ends, but for their own sake. Family, friendship, faith, knowledge, beauty, integrity, honesty. The very sum and substance of the moral life. These are the ennobling qualities and the ennobling virtues. And Cornel often makes the point that there is a particular virtue that is the enabling virtue of those other virtues. You know what that is? Courage. Courage. To practice every other virtue because of the challenges that we come up against, because of the natural fears we'll face, fear of each other, fear of our own futures, fear of not belonging, fear of not being accepted, fear of not fitting in, fear of being considered to be not all that important, fear of being thought to be a loser. It really does take courage to practice those virtues. And of course, among those virtues, as Cornel also points out, is very centrally the virtue of intellectual humility. Now, practicing the virtue of intellectual humility does not mean you can't be a person of conviction. Doesn't mean that you have to be paralyzed and can't act on your convictions. But it's necessary to be a person of intellectual humility, to practice that virtue for one pretty simple reason. And that is our own human fallibility. Now, I assume, but correct me if I'm wrong, that everybody here is fallible. Is there anybody here who's infallible? Pope Francis walking in? Is it? No. And we recognize our own fallibility, rightly recognize our own fallibility, not with respect only to the minor, trivial, superficial things of life. But if we're serious, we recognize our fallibility even about the big, important, morally significant things in life. We can be fallible in our fundamental religious opinion. opinions, our moral beliefs, our political beliefs, our beliefs about human nature and the human good and human dignity and human rights and justice. And we need to be more than merely notionally aware of our fallibility. Notionally means we would check the right box on the SAT or the true-false question. Are you fallible or infallible? We check fallible. It's one thing to be able to check the box, affirm notionally our own fallibility. It's quite another thing, existentially, to embrace and understand and truly acknowledge one's fallibility. Because one acknowledges that, one has to at the same time acknowledge that one's good faith interlocutor actually might be right and I might be wrong, not just about some minor trivial thing, but even about the big, important questions. Or one's interlocutor might be partially right, even though partially wrong. And therefore, I've got something to learn from that person. Or even if I'm fully right and my interlocutor is fully wrong, if my interlocutor is in good faith, an intelligent person, really thinking, then I'll learn from that conversation and having that person challenge my opinions. And we have to be open to being challenged, to having our most deeply held, cherished, even our identity-forming beliefs being challenged. And that's hard because of another feature of human nature. One feature is our fallibility. But there's another one that's a problem. We human beings naturally, it's part of our nature, it's the human condition, wrap our emotions more or less tightly around our convictions. Now, that in itself is not bad. In fact, it's good that we make some emotional investment in our convictions. If we didn't do that, we would never do anything. We'd have beliefs about things, but we wouldn't get anything done. Not just, pursuing big causes or supporting big causes, even the ordinary things of life. Getting this week's readings done, getting this week's lecture prepared, getting the kids up and dressed and fed and off to school. It's one thing to think I should do this, but you need some emotional investment in order to do it. And a fortiori is the same when it comes to working for important causes, especially when one's required to sacrifice for the cause, financially or in terms of reputation or in any other way. So yeah, it's good to have some emotional investment in our convictions. But if we wrap our emotions too tightly around our convictions, as we human beings are prone to do, what happens then? We become dogmatists. We become ideologues. We quickly rush to the conclusion that anybody who disagrees with me must have nefarious motives or be a fool, a bigot, a bad person, who isn't just to be opposed, but who is to be destroyed. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys. We human beings like to think of ourselves as very virtuous, whether we're really virtuous or not. We like that feeling of being virtuous. But as the great teachers of humanity of all traditions, Socrates and Plato, St. Augustine, the great Eastern thinkers, my beloved late friend, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks from Britain, I consider a great teacher of humanity, their message was the opposite. That what really matters is not how you feel. It's not feeling virtuous. That's not why we do the right thing. In order to feel virtuous. Doing the wrong thing will very often make you feel virtuous. It's actually being virtuous. Practicing courage, honesty, integrity, intellectual and personal humility. But it's very hard.
Both of you, I want to pick up on something you've both referenced. You're both professing Christians, one Baptist, the other Catholic. How does your Christian faith shape your scholarship and your politics? And how should we understand that both of you, rooted in a common faith tradition, do come out differently on some pretty important, political questions?
Well, I mean,
But you both still love Jesus, or so you've told me. Yes.
well, we try. Thank God Jesus loves us.
Yeah.
But now Christians been killing each other for a long from the very beginning. Been killing Jews, been killing Turks, been killing Muslims. Muslims been killing Muslims right now in Iran. Jews killing Jews, Jews killing Palestinians, Palestinians killing Jews. It's a human thing all the way down. We haven't got to Asia yet. War, the great Karl von Clausewitz, 1832, his wife put together. War is probably the most persistent and consistent phenomena among we human beings, and politics is nothing but war by other means, as the Clausewitz says. What does that mean? That means we're wretched peoples. We're wretched creatures. What the great Howard Thurman, the teacher of Martin Luther King Jr. coming out of Morehouse, said, the hounds of hell. Greed, individual and organized. Fear, personal and routinized. Hatred, institutionalized and existential. That's who we are as creatures. That's the bad news. That's where the fatalism and the nihilism comes in. Hegel himself, no matter how Eurocentric he is, and he's deeply Eurocentric, he knows absolutely nothing about Africa, but he still has some truths. He says, hey, history is a slaughterhouse. He's partly right. He's very much right. Gibbon says what? History is nothing but a series of human crimes and follies. That's the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire of the 1770s. What brings Brother Robbie and I together, now he is a Christian, Catholic, Thomistic, tied to the greatest Italian philosopher in the history of Italy, St. Thomas Aquinas, Vico's close second. And I am gut bucket, Kierkegaardian, Black Baptist, jazz loving, blues invested, crack vessel trying to love his crooked neighbor with his crooked heart. So that we got strong overlap. It's true. But even to invoke Christianity is just so too abstract. What version are you talking about? Huguenots were Christians. Ask the Catholics about them in the 8 civil wars in France that Montaigne reflects in the middle of such barbarity. Good God, even the technology starts flying out. You start talking about it's just so the real question becomes, are we courageous enough in our thinking and seeing and feeling and acting to remain in dialogue, to learn and listen from one another in such a way that we are stronger and more empowered? And that's very much what University of Florida at its best is about. And University of Florida at its worst is what? The same is true at Harvard and Princeton. Zaytoon was a graduate student in German at Princeton, summa cum laude, graduate at Princeton. I tell all the time, that's a beautiful thing, but don't think too highly of yourself. You're still a human being wrestling with fears, insecurities, and anxieties, and still have challenges to treat people right. And it's difficult to do that as a member of a professional managerial class. Because you've been told that you're so much better. You have an arrogant and condescending and haughty perception of the world and often view the world as if the world evolves around you. No, there's brothers and sisters on the other side of town catching hell. I haven't been to Gainesville that long, but my hunch is there's some folk in Gainesville and Jacksonville and other places catching hell. Poor, working class, all colors. Some of them dealing with vicious legacies of white supremacy, vicious legacies of male supremacy, vicious legacies of poverty, whatever what color. Women dealing with domestic violence and being degraded. There goes Brother West talking about PC chit-chat. No. This is fallible quest for truth and justice, and the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. And if the suffering is not speaking in your life or in your analysis, then you're missing out on something. And yet in the end, no one of us have a monopoly. You know, critical race theory people talk about all the time. I wrote the foreword to the book. Right? Now, what does that mean? Well, I wrote the foreword to the book in part to reflect the spirit of the great Henry James, writing to the less great Robert Louis Stevenson. in January of 1901, where he says, "No theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. And there are deep splinters in all of our eyes. No theory has a monopoly on truth or beauty or goodness. No theology has a monopoly on the holy. Too rich, too complicated. These constructs never can encompass it all. But there are certain theories that are better than other theories." To tell the history of America without saying a word about enslaved Africans or Jim Crow folk, you're going to miss out on a whole lot. And you ain't going to understand nothing about American music at all. You just take the black folk out of American music, and you got geniuses like Stephen Sondheim and them still around, but not a whole lot. Which means what? Which means that no theory can completely embrace all of the complexity, but you need the dialogue, the polyphonic interaction and encounter to learn how to listen and see and then try to act more courageously. That's part of the Socratic legacy. That's part of the prophetic legacy that Heschel talks about in his class. We were just in the Judaica room. Consecrated space. The spirit of Heschel and the others, the spirit of Esther and the others, you see. But it would be true. You could imagine rooms of Islam, rooms of Buddhism, others, consecrated space. Even our precious secular brothers and sisters, the atheists and others. I am a Baptist, but my favorite artist of all time, other than John Coltrane, is Anton Chekhov. Chekhov was an agnostic. Not the kind of agnostic that Madeline Murray O'Hare was. No. She's, or our dear brother Christopher Hitchens and others. They're just too dogmatic in their atheism. I tell them, lighten up, have a drink. You can have cognac with me in the name of Jesus and your atheism because you're too tight. If you're fallible and self-critical, you're not that tight. It's like so many of our Christians. They're so tight and fundamentalist. When you say, deny yourself, pick up your cross and follow me. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Spread that hesed to orphan and widows that you get in Hebrew scripture. Well, that's a little different. Well, what kind of Christian are you then? What kind of orthodoxy are you putting forward? You need more learning how to die. You need more self-criticism in order to learn how to live. Paul says Christians must die daily. Well, we don't like that. We don't like that sentence. Die daily. That was a eulogy that the great Dorothy Day wrote for Martin Luther King Jr. when he was shot dead April 4th, 1968. You read Catholic Worker. Martin Luther King Jr. learned how to die daily. Boom. Boom. Drop the mic. That's it. He wasn't a God. He wasn't a deity. Full of faults. Full of foibles. He chose to criticize himself and others and the society in such a way that he could leave a witness. And there he comes out of our same Baptist tradition, no brother. The kingdom of God is within you, and everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. That is at the level of praxis, of deed, the level of action, not just what you say and how you act and the language that you use that brings attention to you rather than focuses on the suffering and the catastrophe that you're trying to make sense out of, be it ecological, be it social, be it economic, be it personal. And we live in catastrophic times. That's why the issues of nihilism and fatalism and despair can be very overwhelming, especially, I think, the younger generation, because we didn't grow up with all this ecological crisis and the people feeling as if there's just no way out. We always felt we had some great examples that would provide us, but I think it is in some ways a different moment. You do agree with that, don't you?
Chekhov is interesting. As Brother West mentioned, Chekhov's a very different sort of agnostic from the sort of new atheists that are so familiar to us today, Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and so forth. Chekhov's problem was he believed Christianity, the Christian story, Jesus' message, was too beautiful to be true. That's a different basis for atheism.
Oh, absolutely. Well, he accepted the Christian love and compassion. There's more Christian love in the Chekhov play than a lot of Christian churches out here. There's no doubt, because he loves all the characters. Absolute condemnation of no one. Absolute compassion for everyone. Natasha and the three sisters. You see? Yeah. Even the gangster-like figures. He finds something love about them. That's what he learned. So when he went to the Orthodox, that great Russian Orthodox tradition has been so often used in vicious ways against Jews and others, he would just sit there, tears in his eyes, and say, it's just too beautiful to be true. I'm trying to live it every day, but I can't accept the conclusions. Christian compassion without the Christian conclusion. That's still power. Artistically speaking. That's still power. I just think he's wrong on the God question. But he was ambiguous because he was a good fallibilist, so he wasn't completely sure. He was agnostic. Mm-hmm.
Now, what Brother Cornel did not tell you is that when he was a professor at Harvard, after he left me to go to Harvard, at Princeton, our beloved Zaytoun had the decision to make whether to go to Harvard, where Daddy was, or go to Princeton, where Uncle Robbie was. She made the right decision. You're right, Will, that one of the things that brings Cornel and me together, grounds many of our shared values, is our shared Christian faith. And that gives us a kind of kinship with each other. And a kinship not only with fellow Christians, but with other believers. We know what that means. Our Jewish brothers and sisters, Muslim brothers and sisters. He and I have both interacted in very fruitful and productive ways with people from the East. Cornel is a real hero in the Dalit community. I had the beautiful privilege of studying with the great Theravada Buddhist monk and abbot, Jalkun Rajavaramuni. There's enormous wisdom in these different traditions. There really is, more in the heaven and earth than can be discovered in your philosophy, Arsha.
That's right.
And it seems to me that at the bottom of it all, when it comes to the Christian faith on the ethical side of things, is what I sometimes call the moral principle. That is the foundational moral principle. How it applies, it's not so clear. Sometimes it's very clear, but on a lot of issues it's not clear, and so reasonable people of goodwill disagree. But on the principle we can agree, and then we can work together, struggling, sometimes dialectically arguing with each other to try to figure out what it means. But it's important to understand the principle and to embrace the principle. What is that principle? That principle is the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. That's it. That's the principle. The profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. It finds expression in many of the great thinkers. Immanuel Kant, in one of his three great formulations of what he called the categorical imperative, taught that we should treat humanity, whether in the person of oneself or another, always as an end, and never as a means only. He's just articulating that principle, the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. Where do we get that? Well, it appears first, as far as I know, in the form of the story, the teaching told in Genesis 1, the very first book of the Bible, in the very first chapter. God makes the heavens and the earth and the fish in the seas and the animals and the birds of the air, the brute animals. And then he makes man. And man is set apart from all the other creatures, all other aspects of creation, because man he makes in his own image and likeness. Now, that gives us a certain profound standing, what Kant would call dignity. Something that might actually puff us up. We are God-like, made in the very image and likeness of God. But notice that the story also tells us what we're made out of. Do you remember your Bible? What is man made from? What he's fashioned from? The very dust of the earth. So in some of the great liturgical traditions, Catholicism, Anglicanism, I think this is true in the Orthodox traditions, on Ash Wednesday, as we prepare for Lent, the priest puts the ashes on the forehead and says, "Remember, man, that thou art dust, and to dust you shall return." So we can't get too pumped up. We're made out of the mere dust of the earth, and yet made in the very image and likeness of God. Now, the great thinkers, the theologians, the philosophers, the bishops and popes and great religious leaders of history have always struggled to figure out, well, what exactly does that mean that we're made in the image and likeness of God? It can't mean that God has 5 fingers on each of 2 hands and hair on his head and a nose. God's not material. So it must mean something like this, that we are godlike inasmuch as we have agency. Unlike the brute animals, we have the godlike powers of reason and freedom. The power to do in a limited, finite, very circumscribed way what God does in Genesis 1. Envisage a state of affairs that doesn't exist. Understand the point, the value, the purpose, the good to be achieved in bringing that state of affairs into existence. And then acting, not by impulse or on instinct like a brute animal, but freely on the basis of our rational grasp of the intelligible point of bringing it into existence, to bring that reality into existence. Ordinarily, as we go through the day, exercising our human reason and freedom, what we achieve is very mundane. We have mundane tasks and we do them. The alligators out there in the pond can't do that. You know, the birds in the air can't do that, but human beings can do that. But of course, sometimes we do profound things. We form a friendship, a genuine friendship. Not merely in its affective dimension, an emotional bond, but where it's a fully volitional reality. We are willing the good of the other for the sake of the other. Or a work of art, which may or may not be, you might be the rare character who's Michelangelo or Raphael, or one of the great artists, or you might just be someone whose work will never be recognized, but you've made a beautiful thing. You've done that exercising your reason and your freedom, your creativity. You do that because you're an agent, because you're godlike. And the great teaching, at least of the Jewish and Christian traditions, and I think there are echoes of this in the others that don't have our story of man, our being the Christian and Jewish story, the biblical story of man in the image and likeness of God. The great teaching is that it's in that quality, our status as rational creatures, our nature as creative and free creatures, that our dignity lies. So why should we respect the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family? Because we are bearers of dignity, creatures made in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, never to be relegated to the status of a mere means to other people's ends, but always as an end in itself. Now, what is the human record on respect for that principle? As Cornel has pointed out in his Baptist way, very bleak. I love my Protestant brothers because they have such a profound understanding of human fallenness, human depravity. Those of us on the Catholic side, we of course acknowledge original sin and human fallenness, but maybe we don't think we've fallen quite that far off the edge. But however that may be, across the board, no matter how thoroughgoing we think the fall is or how depraved, we don't regard anybody as beyond redemption. There's nobody who is not to be loved and cherished. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to agree with what they do. You can oppose them. Sometimes you have to oppose them because they're on that side, they're on this side. You have a profound difference of principle, good people struggling with each other, but you don't have the option of just treating them as dirt, as garbage, dismissing them, not allowing them to have their dignity. It can be tough, obviously, and the whole history of war, of mankind is, as Cornel pointed out, quoting Clausewitz, a history of war and destruction. But we know we have very good reasons to aspire to, and to work for something better. And that's why we do honor the great heroes of history who have worked for something better. The Fannie Lou Hamers you mentioned, Harriet Tubman, my great hero. Cornel and I both have a great regard for Tubman. Abraham Joshua Heschel, Cornel has mentioned. Dorothy Day, you mentioned. Martin Luther King, obviously. People who want to make the world better. Those people aren't all going to agree about how to do it, because what follows for this or that particular issue from the principle of the profound inherent and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family will in many cases be very unclear. And radically different conclusions can be drawn by reasonable people of goodwill about what is required. Conclusions that put you in conflict with each other. And yet, it's our condition to have to do it and do the best we can, acknowledging our fallibility, knowing that some very high percentage of the time, we're going to get it wrong.
So one more question from me. The title of our event today is Truth-Seeking and Democracy. And I think it's that broader commitment to truth-seeking as well as to democracy. It brings all of us together here. What are you most worried about, the biggest threats you see to American democracy today? And what makes you most hopeful about our democracy?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that all democratic experiments are very fragile, and they tend not to last that long. Remember, Plato's argument in the Republic is anybody who thinks that they can sustain a democratic experiment cannot be serious, given the overwhelming, unruly passion and ubiquitous ignorance of the demos that will always overflow. And that anytime you think you can sustain it, there will come then the tyrant. And the tyrant will do what? Tease out even more unruly passions, accent more ubiquitous ignorance, and then create disorder, massive disorder. And that's precisely why the tyrant becomes seductive. Because people see the disorder and they opt for the hierarchy. Whereas democracy is about what? Justice from below, the demos, little Sly Stone called everyday people. And so the claim is that, this is why Plato was still profound but wrong, because I'm a radical Democrat, but I know I'm making a leap of faith in the capacities of human beings to educate themselves and muster enough vision and courage and compassion to be concerned about all in the public square, rather than just their individual families and tribes and clans. What we love about the Greeks, even given the slavocratic backdrop, even given the imperial backdrop, even given the patriarchal backdrop, they had a conception of themselves that transcended tribe and clan. That's what the deme was. So they created something called public. And that public is the very stuff of any democracy. So we look at the history of the United States, right? How do you create a public? Well, first you own somebody else's land. Was that a Socratic dialogue in terms of how you got it? Tell the truth. Then you got these precious Africans enslaved. That will be one of the fundamental foundations, economic foundations for your democracy. But when you write your Constitution, there'll be no reference to the institution of slavery. You end up writing a Civil War over an institution not even invoked in your Constitution. That's called denial. And when you deny something, chickens come back to roost. It's going to come back to haunt you. Sooner or later, you have to come to terms with it. Here come 1861. Oh, shucks. White supremacy haunting us down. Not some kind of abstract demon in history, but moving through the hearts and minds and souls of concrete human beings. And keep in mind, when we talk about white supremacy, we're also talking about black folk. Because there's white supremacy inside of black people. Is that right, my brother? It's deeply inside of us, right? But we can fight it. No matter what color you are, gender, you can fight it. The male supremacy inside of women, told they're less intelligent, and all these other vicious patriarchal lies that women have to come to terms with. So we have to acknowledge then, these democratic experiments are fragile. And how do you keep them alive? Part of what Brother Robbie and I have been trying to do for the last 20 years, be on the black side of Dallas or the white side of San Francisco. Integrity, honesty, decency, compassion, justice, rather than hatred, revenge, avarice, greed, manipulation, and rationalizing domination. That's a fundamental human choice. And the people decide. The United States is the 68th empire in the history of the species. There have been 70. That's what Neil Ferguson said. And I believe it. He's a sophisticated historian, deeply conservative. The conservatives have some insight.
Darn right.
Oh, Lord. Indeed.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah, they missed that last. You said something about conservatives have insight.
Oh. Brother Robbie.
Oh no, it's all about.
I'll hold it. I can hold it up at this point. But I've probably talked enough. But my point is this, that it means then, at this particular moment, what we need is Socratic courage, the courage to question and scrutinize ourselves. The unexamined life is not worth living. We need the courage to hope. But there's no hope without wrestling with despair. That's what the 32nd chapter of Genesis is all about in that magisterial Hebrew scripture, right? Jacob is wrestling with the angel of death in the midnight hour. He emerges with a new name, Israel. What does Israel mean? God wrestler. Wrestling with what? The forces of death, dread, despair, disappointment, domination, but never allowing them to have the last word. He moves with new energy, wound, new vision, new vitality, new vibrancy. That's the biblical insight. And there's a whole host of other examples that we can mention. For young people these days, it's mainly the arts. Because so many young folk are unchurched, more and more biblically illiterate. You know, you can make a reference to Jacob and you figure you're talking about some baseball player. No, we talking about the biblical Jacob. But there's insights in the music. Kendrick Lamar got some insights. He's very Socratic, isn't he? He hurts himself, giving the self-criticism he's got flowing. And we mentioned, I won't mention any other names for the younger generation because they know so much better than ours. But that's what's required. Examples. Kant says examples are the go-kart of judgment and critique of pure reason. He's absolutely right. And we simply try to exemplify that fallibility and that humility. And we haven't even got to some of our deep disagreements yet. Because we didn't come here to put on a show and duke it out the way you can get it on social media or any other market-driven site that's obsessed with what? Career, constituency, market opportunities, and bringing attention simply to themselves rather than oneself being vehicles and vessels to focus on the catastrophes, the suffering, the struggling, the wretchedness, and the wonderfulness that you get in Antigone's Sophocles, that beautiful, beautiful moment. How wretched and wonderful we are simultaneously. And that's our pagan brothers and sisters. Yeah, that's our precious, secular, pre-modern, pagan brothers and sisters with Sophocles. And it's hard to get deeper than Sophocles, even though we've got different cultures around the world who in some ways have affinities with him. I think my thing is completely broke here, though, isn't it? Is yours working all right?
Yeah, I'm looking. Can you hear us?
Yeah, that's cool.
So, the American founders had their virtues and they had their faults. They had their agreements and they had quite profound disagreements. But one thing they agreed on, interestingly, from our perspective now, as 21st century Americans, one thing they agreed on was that democracy was not the way to go. Are you shocked? If you read the Federalist Papers, those op-ed pieces written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay to try to persuade the citizens of New York, published in newspapers, just like op-ed pieces today, to persuade the citizens of New York to ratify the proposed Constitution. If you read the Federalist Papers, those of you who have read them, I won't ask for a show of hands on this one, but those of you who have read them, If you're associated with the Hamilton program, you will read them. You know that they go out of their way to say, now one thing we want to avoid is democracy. Why? They didn't valorize democracy the way we tend to do. They didn't treat it as the panacea, the solution to all problems. In fact, they saw serious defects, and Professor West has already touched on some of them. Who killed Socrates? Who murdered Socrates? Athenian democracy. Democracy? The great thing? Democracy? Murdered Socrates? Yeah. Democracy murdered Socrates. The founders were worried that democracy, for all the reasons that Cornel just went through, degenerates into mob rule. And then what happens when democracy fails? It always collapses into the worst forms of tyranny. So when, having against all odds, succeeded in a revolution against the most powerful military on earth, the British Empire, their big question then, they're suddenly facing the problem, now what do we do? What form of government do we establish here? How do we avoid replicating right here on these shores the very tyranny that we objected to under King George? One possibility was to have a better monarchy. And some of our ancestors thought, yeah, and we've got just the right man. We've got George Washington. What a great king he'll be. He did something nobody else in history had ever done. He returned power after being a successful general winning a war. Nobody did that. What's more, he didn't want to be king. There's your best king, the king who doesn't want to be king. But in the end, they said, no, we're not going to opt for a monarchy. We're not going to opt for an oligarchy. We're not going to opt for a democracy. We're going to go for a republic. Notice Professor West was putting a lot of emphasis on that term public. Public. Res public. The public thing. A mixed regime. One with powerful democratic impulses so that we could honestly say, as Lincoln 7 years later would say, that this experiment is an experiment in government of the people, which all government is, by the people and for the people. It's the government by the people that's the democratic element of our republic. But they also wanted to build in constitutional structural constraints on the exercise of democratic power. And they did that in a variety of ways. And if you study in the Hamilton program, you will learn all about those ways. Establishing the national government as a government of delegated and enumerated powers, not exercising general jurisdiction or plenary authority over the range of subjects, leaving general jurisdiction in the states, closer to the people, more accountable to the people. It's an imperfect system, but they opted for it for a reason. Separating powers within the national government so that the powers of the executive were not derivative of the legislative, nor the legislative of the executive. And the judicial power would be independent. There's a new idea. Not part of the executive power. All to create a system of checks that would enable something to happen that had never happened before in history. And that is government by the people succeeding. Instead of failing as it had in antiquity, in the Greek city-states, as it had in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance city-states, for once seeing if it could be made to work. And that's why Lincoln, when he uttered those famous words at Gettysburg, said that this war is to test the proposition, the Civil War with all its carnage, 750,000 deaths on a population of 20-something million. Unbelievable carnage, unprecedented carnage. Lincoln said this war will test whether we will have a new birth of freedom. So the government of the people, by the people, and for the people will not perish from what? The North American landmass? No. What was the word he used? Will not perish from the earth. Why did he say the earth? Because he knew that if this one last grand experiment in Republican government failed here after 77 years of trying, if it failed, it would be because of slavery. If it failed here, that the lesson people would draw into the human future is that human beings cannot govern themselves. Human nature is such that we are not the kinds of creatures that can govern ourselves. The best we can hope for is to be governed by a benign despot. The best we can hope for is a benign rather than malignant form of authoritarianism. And indeed, I believe that would have been the lesson drawn had the country failed, had secession succeeded. Lincoln saw this. He knew that would be succeeded by further secessions from within the Confederate new nation and within the rump of the Union. So it was a blessing. All the carnage, of course, was an enormous cost to pay, but it was a blessing that the Union was preserved and that we don't have to draw the conclusion that human beings are not fit for self-government.
All right, we are nearing the end. I had promised a little bit of time for questions from the audience, so we're just going to be able to take one and wrap it up because
we can take more. We can take more.
Well, they're making us give up the room, and we've got to do this.
We got a room.
Thing. Yeah,
Oh,
that's
okay.
right. So, I don't want my first Hamilton Center event at the University of Florida to be my last Hamilton Center event. So, all right.
This guy's got it.
Okay, all right. You look like a student, right?
Yes.
Sure. Okay. All right.
That's what we want.
Okay.
My name is Andrew Lyons. I'm an undergraduate student here at the university. My question is, who were some of your role models?
Ooh.
What were some of the values and traits that they had that you carry in your everyday life?
There you go.
Well, I started with Irene and Cliff West.
There you go.
I can almost stop there. But as I grew up, it became the Fannie Lou Hamers and Ella Bakers and Martin Luther King Jr.'s and Rabbi Heschel's, Edward Said's, Dorothy Day's, James Lawson's. All these are exemplars of finite fallen human beings who decide to be courageous and compassionate forces for good. Not because they went to college, but because the best of any college passed through them. Like Lincoln. Lincoln got 1 year formal education. Can you imagine if we had to wait for a graduate of Harvard to do what Lincoln did? Don't hold your breath. Don't hold your breath. Abe was fallen, but all he needed was Shakespeare, King Lear, his mama, and wrestling with his family, and the courage to grow. Because he wanted to send black people out of the United States in 1862, didn't he? Frederick Douglass called him what? A slave hound from Illinois when he gave that first inauguration saying, I'll compromise with the South, and the South wants to create a regime in which black people are enslaved in perpetuity for the history of the world. Lincoln was willing to compromise. Frederick Douglass said, you got to be kidding. A year and a half later, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman sitting there in the office. Why? Social forces bigger than Lincoln in the society, pushing him. And he's willing to grow, adapt, almost like a jazz man, improvisational, flexible, fluid, learning, listening. So those are they who have been inspiration for me. Though I should end with this, I do believe that the musicians are the vanguard of species. I really do. I really do. It's the Duke Ellingtons and it's the Curtis Mayfields and Stephen Sondheims and Sarah Vaughan's and Janis Joplin's and Jimi Hendrix. Why? Because they dig deep inside of their souls in the dark corners and transfigure their own wounds into gifts that touch us so that we become forces for good. So one of the challenges of any curriculum, including Hamilton here, is make sure that you've got the great examples of the artists in your dialogue so that the political scientists and the social scientists and all the other ones who have the rigorous analysis, oftentimes driven by jargon, but still full of insight sometimes, they don't become so hegemonic that people lose sight of all of their humanity, because you have to put your whole self in it. You can't sustain a democracy unless you have kenosis,
Self-emptying.
the emptying of oneself, the giving of one, serving others, putting the welfare of others above those of yourself, beginning with one's own family, and then spilling over, not just in America, but around the world, in Asia, in Africa, the Caribbean, because we are part of a human project. And some of us even are in love with elephants and other sentient creatures that I would include in terms of embracing their specialness. The cockroaches, I haven't got there yet. Pray for me on the cockroaches. But the elephants and the dogs and the cats and others, they deserve a certain kind of treatment too. You see what I mean? So in that sense, that's what inspires me. That's why all the despair I have, I never allow it to have the last word.
Tell them,
Never ever.
tell them who you're going out to see tomorrow.
Oh yeah, I got to catch flights 5 o'clock tomorrow because I'm doing a program with the greatest love warrior of his generation. He sees things that others don't see, though he may be physically blind. His name is Stevie Wonder.
Is that cool?
Yes. You can just go home tonight and listen to Love in Need of Love. And he wrote that over 35 years ago. You know what I mean?
I'd love to.
I hear you.
Do we have time for? Yeah, so very quick. I mentioned earlier, actually, I've always enormously admired Harriet Tubman. Her courage, extraordinary, her faith, holding on to hope against all odds, working diligently, so many disadvantages, and yet carries on. So about a decade ago, I became the chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, as Professor Stiniford kindly mentioned. And I was going to be sworn in to that office by the Chief Justice of the United States, Chief Justice Roberts, at the Supreme Court in his chambers. So I wanted two things. One, I wanted to be sworn in on a historically important Bible. Bible that was historically important from the human rights point of view. I was going to be entering a big human rights job. So I went online it's such a blessing to be able to go online and look these things up. So I figured Harriet Tubman must have a Bible. Where is it? So I found the Harriet Tubman House in Auburn, New York, and I called up there. I found out that they had the Bible. I called up there, and a very nice lady answered the phone and said, "I'm Robert George. I'm a professor at Princeton. I've been named the chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I'm going to be sworn in at the Supreme Court by Chief Justice Roberts, and I would love to be sworn in on Harriet Tubman's Bible. I'm wondering if there would be a way that I could borrow the Bible." And she hesitated for a moment, and then I told her the other thing that I wanted, which was I said, well, my dear friend Professor Cornel West is going to be holding the Bible. And she said, we'll have it right down to So the appointed day came, and I was down there with my beloved daughter, Rachel, who's 18 now, and my wife, Cindy, and my parents were there. It was a wonderful occasion. We had tea, and then we went over to the Supreme Court, and we were walking up the steps of the great marble temple. You know, it's so impressive, the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. If you haven't seen it, you've got to see it. And I had that great, it's a big Bible. I mean, it's about this big, it's a huge Bible. And I had it under my arm like this. Cornel and I were walking along together up those steps, and we're smiling, chatting, looking forward. And I see there's security people there, police officers. And I see Cornel catch the eye of a police officer, and the police officer catches his eye, and they just look at each other, stone-faced like this. I'm wondering, what's that all about? And so we walked further, and once we're out of earshot, I turned to Cornel and I said, Brother Cornel, what was that between you and that police officer? And he said, oh, that's the guy who arrested me 2 weeks ago when I was down here protesting at the Supreme Court. He said, Brother Robbie, come think of it, I've never been to the Supreme Court before when I wasn't here to get arrested.
All right. Well, I think it's hard to top that one as a note to end on. So, Eva, just to wrap up here, everyone, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you for your, even with the range of viewpoints and backgrounds here, your shared commitment to truth-seeking and democracy and open and civil discourse here at the University of Florida. Special thanks to Professor David Canton over there and the African American Studies program, our co-sponsor, and then Professor Matt Jacobs in the Bob Graham Center just had to step
Brother
out.
Clay Green, too. Yes, indeed.
Please do, if you haven't already, sign up the old-fashioned way for our email list for wonderful future events like this. We promise no spam, no requests for money, just a good time and interesting speakers. Forgive me that I will need to escort our speakers out pretty expeditiously because we do need to give up the room and they've got a meeting with some of our students. But have a great week. It's really special to be with you here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.